Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really plunging into quite an incredible period in American history, the years between 1865 and 1900.
It's a period of just staggering change.
Absolutely. Think about it, the nation's population actually doubled to roughly 80 million, and the urban population, well, it tripled.
Tripled. That's massive.
Yeah, by 1900, something like 40% of Americans lived in cities. It's this fundamental reshaping, from largely rural to increasingly urban.
And the scale of the cities themselves, I mean, it's mind-blowing. By 1900, New York City was the second largest in the world. 3.5 million people.
Wow.
And you had Chicago, Philadelphia both topping a million. Just compare that to 1860.
Right. When no U.S. city even had 1 million residents, it's almost hard to grasp that speed of change.
It really is.
Okay, so today our mission really is to unpack this. What was driving this huge surge in cities and immigration? We want to explore the opportunities, the immense challenges, and the cultural shifts that really define this time for you, our listener.
Sounds good. Where should we start? The cities themselves.
Yeah, let's dive right into the physical transformation. How did these cities actually look different?
Well, the skyline is the most obvious thing. Suddenly you have skyscrapers starting to appear.
Right, because of steel.
Exactly. Structural steel was revolutionary, so strong for its weight. And you pair that with the perfected elevator, suddenly building high becomes practical.
And this wasn't just building tall for the sake of it, right? There was that idea, form follows function.
Precisely. Louis Sullivan was a key proponent. It reflected this, industrial society's focus, purpose over just pure ornament. It really shaped modern architecture.
And it wasn't just vertical growth. Connecting these sprawling cities was key too, like the Brooklyn Bridge.
Oh, absolutely. An engineering marvel by John Roebling, linking, what was it, the first and third largest U.S. cities at the time? A huge symbol.
Yeah, a symbol of connection.
And connection within the cities became vital too. As they sprawled outwards, people had to commute.
So mass transit.
Electric trolleys were a game changer, and that led directly to the growth of streetcar suburbs. People could live further out from the intense urban core.
So you've got cities growing up and out simultaneously. But it wasn't just a big, undifferentiated blob, was it? They started getting carved up.
Very much so. Cities developed these distinct districts, business centers, industrial areas, residential zones.
And those residential zones, they weren't all mixed together.
No, often quite segregated. You saw divisions pretty clearly drawn along lines of race, ethnicity, and social class. It created a very layered, stratified city.
Okay, so the cities are physically transforming. What was actually pulling people in? What was the lure?
Well, fundamentally, it boiled down to opportunity, economic and social chances that, frankly, rural America often couldn't match.
A sense of possibility.
Exactly. A different kind of life seemed possible. And you saw it physically in the mushrooming commercial districts.
Those huge department stores starting to appear must have been quite something.
Oh, absolutely transformative. More than just shops, they were social places, offering this incredible variety. And cities had modern stuff.
Right. Things we take for granted now.
Like electricity, indoor plumbing, telephones. Becoming more common in cities while still rare out in the country.
We often think of the workforce then as mostly male, but cities opened up new avenues for women too, didn't they?
A really significant shift. In the 1890s alone, over 1 million new female workers joined the urban workforce.
Doing what kind of jobs?
You see women becoming social workers, secretaries, store clerks, telephone operators, roles that just didn't really exist for them in the same way rurally.
Sounds like progress, but I'm guessing the reality wasn't always glamorous.
Oh, far from it. Working conditions, especially in factories, could be deplorable. Sweatshops, long hours, low pay. That was common.
And social expectations still played a big role.
Definitely. For middle and upper class women, working outside the home was generally frowned upon. Teaching and nursing were sort of the acceptable exceptions.
But the sheer number is still striking. By 1900, over 5 million women working for wages.
It is, and the breakdown tells you a lot. Almost 20% in clothing and textiles, nearly 40% in domestic service. Then you have farm laborers, teachers, sales clerks.
And mostly young, unmarried women.
Overwhelmingly. Typically young, often from poorer backgrounds, and usually single.
You mentioned these emerging castes among women workers. Can you unpack that a bit?
Sure. There's definitely a hierarchy. Clerical jobs, like secretaries, were often seen as more respectable and tended to go to American girls, usually meaning white Anglo-Saxon Protestants.
Okay.
Factory work paid the bills but didn't have the same status. That often drew farm girls or working-class women, and you saw some early union activity there.
And domestic service.
That was kind of at the bottom rung, often filled by foreign-born women, especially Irish immigrants, or black women. The hours were incredibly long, and they had basically no organizational support.
So this economic boom, it clearly wasn't lifting all boats equally. You mentioned stratification earlier.
Understatement of the century, maybe. By 1900, wealth inequality in America was probably more extreme than at any other point in its history.
Really?
Yeah. You had the rise of the nouveau riche, newly wealthy industrialists and financiers, and the stats are just, well, jaw-dropping. In 1890, the top 1% owned 51% of all property.
51% for the top 1%.
Yeah, and the bottom 44% of families,
Mm-hmm.
they own just 1.2%.
Wow. That's stark. What did life look like for that wealthy elite?
Immense privilege. Lots of travel, often to Europe, private education, multiple homes, city mansions, country estates, yachts, carriages, later cars, armies of servants.
And they had a certain view of their role.
Often, yeah. This idea of an identity of interest, that their prosperity naturally benefited everyone else, a view not always shared by those lower downs, of
Of
course.
course. So what about the middle class? Who were they and what was their life like?
The middle class grew significantly. Think salesmen, clerks, government workers, teachers, lawyers, doctors, mostly WASPO, though that varied. They lived comfortably.
Awesome.
Relatively large homes usually could afford at least one servant, but also bound by pretty strict social conventions, especially for women focus on domesticity, avoiding controversy.
And then the working class,
Mm.
the backbone of the industrial engine.
Often Catholic, many foreign-born from Eastern and Southern Europe or African Americans. Their employment was often precarious, high rates of unemployment were
And
common.
child labor was a big issue.
Huge.
Yeah.
Nearly 20% of kids under 15 were working outside of agriculture by 1900. For working-class women, work was usually that period between school and marriage. Young, generally.
With all these people pouring in and this inequality, the cities must have had some serious problems.
Oh, absolutely. Conditions could be truly deplorable. Crime was a major issue. Everything from theft to prostitution, gambling, violence.
And sanitation, just keeping up.
A massive challenge. Systems were just overwhelmed by the rapid growth. And housing, well, the infamous dumbbell tenement is a prime example.
What
Designed to meet minimum light and air requirements. But in practice, they were incredibly high-density, poorly ventilated fire traps. It's estimated half of New York City's population lived in tenements like these. Cramped, unhealthy.
Just grim. Okay, let's shift focus a bit to the people fueling this growth, the immigrants themselves. You mentioned old versus new immigration.
Yeah.
What's the core distinction?
It's mainly about timing and origin. Old immigration, say up to the 1880s, was mostly from Britain, Western Europe, think Germans, Scandinavians, often Protestant, higher literacy, tended to assimilate maybe a bit more readily.
Okay.
New immigration, roughly 1880 to 1920, was huge. Maybe 27 million people came, though about 11 million eventually went back. These folks were largely from Eastern and Southern Europe.
So Italians, Jews, Poles, Greeks.
Exactly. Lots of different groups. And this wave really changed the demographic makeup of the cities.
Dramatically, I imagine.
Oh, yeah. By 1910, like a third of Americans were either foreign-born or had at least one foreign-born parent. Ellis Island is the famous entry point, but people came in through other ports too.
And they tended to stick together in the cities.
Very much so. They formed these tight-knit ethnic enclaves, Little Italy, Greektown, Jewish neighborhoods. Sometimes these city neighborhoods were bigger than the towns they'd left back home.
And they brought different cultural backgrounds, religion, politics.
Right. Many were Orthodox Christians or Jewish, often came from places without strong democratic traditions. Illiteracy rates were generally higher than among the old immigrants.
So they worked hard to maintain their cultures.
Definitely. You saw the rise of parochial schools, Hebrew schools, foreign language newspapers, theaters, social clubs. It was this dual effort trying to adapt but also hold on to their heritage. The kids, the first generation born here, often assimilated more quickly.
What were the big push and pull factors driving them here? Why leave home?
On the push side, you had things like overpopulation in Europe, economic disruption from industrialization, kicking people off the land, limited prospects.
And the pull, America the Golden Land.
Pretty much. The idea of opportunity was huge. The Statue of Liberty, Emma Lazarus's poem, powerful symbols. Plus, American industries actively wanted cheap labor. And sadly, Persecution back home was a major factor, too.
Especially for Jewish people in Russia.
Yes, the pogroms drove many to emigrate. It was a complex mix of hope and desperation.
And you mentioned a significant number went back. It wasn't always a one-way street.
That's really important. Maybe a quarter of those who came between 1820 and 1900 eventually returned. Some made money and went home better off. Others maybe never felt fully American or intended to stay permanently.
Now, there's one group whose experience was quite distinct during this time, the Chinese immigrants.
Yes, their story is different for the European new immigration.
Yeah.
The Burlingame Treaty in 1868 initially facilitated their arrival, largely for railroad work. Seward, the Secretary of State, also hoped it would boost trade.
And they became a significant presence, especially in California.
By 1870, yeah. They were vital in the gold fields first, then absolutely indispensable for building the Transcontinental Railroad under brutal conditions.
And after the railroad.
Many moved into service industries, becoming cooks, laundry workers, domestic servants. Interestingly, a higher percentage returned home compared to Europeans, and their communities, the Chinatowns, tended to be heavily male-dominated.
But the reception, it turned ugly, didn't it?
Tragically ugly. Once the railroad was done, and especially when the economy tanked in the 1870s, friction with white workers exploded, particularly the Irish in California, led by Dennis Kearney.
Why the friction? Competition for jobs.
That was a big part of it. And employers sometimes used Chinese workers to break strikes or keep wages low, which really inflamed tensions. They were scapegoated, called coolies, faced violence, terror campaigns.
And this led to political action.
Directly. Kearney's Working Men's Party of California basically had one goal: get the Chinese out. They gained real political power, influenced the state constitution.
Which then led to national policy.
Sadly, yes. It culminated in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. It slammed the door shut on Chinese immigration basically until 1943, a really shameful episode showing the dark side of this era.
So, with all these diverse groups arriving, facing different receptions, how did American society as a whole react? It must have been complicated.
Incredibly varied. On one hand, you had urban political machines. They saw immigrants as, well, voters.
Trading favors for votes?
Essentially. Providing jobs, help with housing, maybe intervening with the law in exchange for political support. Tammany Hall in New York is the classic example. George Washington Plunkett even called it honest graft.
Honest graft, right. Reformers must have hated that.
Oh, they despised it, saw it as pure corruption, and fought hard against it.
But there were also people genuinely trying to help the newcomers adjust.
Absolutely. The social gospel movement was significant. People like Rauschenbusch and Gladden argued for applying Christian ethics to solve urban problems: poverty, alcoholism, unemployment, often driven by a mix of genuine concern and maybe a fear of social unrest from the working class.
And the settlement house movement, that was mostly women, right?
Primarily, yes. Educated, often middle-class women. Jane Addams's Hull House in Chicago is legendary.
Yeah.
They lived in immigrant neighborhoods and offered practical help. English classes, healthcare, childcare, community events really help people navigate this new, complex urban world.
Important figures came out of that.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Lillian Wald, Florence Kelly, pioneers who went on to fight for labor laws, better sanitation, child welfare, really important social reformers.
And other organizations popped up, too.
Yeah, Clara Barton founded the American Red Cross in 1881, and the municipal housekeeping movement focused on cleaning up poor neighborhoods, improving living conditions. But
There's always a but.
alongside the helping hands, there was a strong backlash. Anti-foreignism or nativism.
Fear and hostility towards immigrants, what fueled that?
A whole mix of things. Cultural and religious differences bred suspicion. But LTB's worried about being outnumbered,
Yeah.
Anxieties about higher immigrant birth rates, talk of racial mongrelization, economic fears too, immigrants taking jobs, driving down wages, and worries about foreign ideas, socialism, anarchism.
Did this become organized?
Oh, yes. Groups like the American Protective Association, APA, sprang up, targeting Catholics specifically. Labor leaders often resented immigrants being used as strikebreakers.
And influential voices promoted these views.
People like Reverend Josiah Strong, his book Our Country, was widely read. He mixed nativist arguments with genuine concerns about urban problems, which made his message quite potent.
This rapid change must have shaken up established ideas about morality, too.
Yeah, definitely. Many traditional wayships felt Victorian morals were crumbling. You had figures like Victoria Woodhull pushing radical ideas about free love and women's rights, which scared a lot of people.
Leading to pushback like the Comstock Law.
Exactly. Anthony Comstock led the charge against anything deemed obscene. It was a reaction against perceived moral decay,
And alcohol became a huge flashpoint.
a massive one. Liquor consumption had increased after the Civil War. Immigrant groups often had different cultural traditions around drinking compared to temperance-minded Protestants. Saloons were central to working-class male social life.
Enter the WCTU.
The Women's Christian Temperance Union. Hugely powerful. Led by Frances Willard, they became incredibly effective lobbyists for prohibition. They started linking alcohol to poverty, domestic violence.
And they saw suffrage as key.
Increasingly, yes. Give women the vote, they argued, and they'll vote for temperance. They also touched on things like Planned Parenthood. Willard was quite forward-thinking in some ways.
Though not everyone was as strategic. Carrie Nation.
Yes, Carrie Nation and her hatchet represented the more direct action wing of the movement. But eventually, the more politically savvy Anti-Saloon League became dominant, pushing for local and state restrictions, paving the way for the 18th Amendment.
And alongside temperance, the fight for women's suffrage itself was evolving.
Yes, urban life offered women more independence, birth rates were falling, women were marrying later, the suffrage movement, which had split after the Civil War.
Right, the NWSA and AWSA.
Exactly. Stanton and Anthony's group, Lucy Stone's group, they finally merged in 1890 to form the National American Woman Suffrage Association, NASA.
Were they making much headway nationally?
Progress was slow in the late 19th century at the national level, but they had successes. Women got the vote in some local elections, especially school board stuff, and 4 western states, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, Idaho, granted full suffrage.
That's significant.
And crucial property rights gains, too. By 1890, most states let married women own property in their own name. Incremental, but important steps.
How did established religion cope with all this urban, industrial, immigrant upheaval?
It was a challenge. Protestant churches sometimes struggled to connect with the new urban masses. Their traditional models didn't always fit.
But the Catholic Church did better.
Often, yes. It already had strong roots in many immigrant communities and grew rapidly with them. Meanwhile, you had urban revivalists like Dwight Lyman Moody trying to adapt Protestant messages for city dwellers.
And new religious movements.
Yes, like Christian Science, founded by Mary Baker Eddy. It was a period of spiritual searching and innovation, too.
And intellectually, the big earthquake was Darwin, right?
Absolutely huge. Origin of the species, evolution, survival of the fittest. It fundamentally challenged traditional religious beliefs, especially literal interpretations of the Bible.
Creating that split.
Yeah, the divide between fundamentalists, holding to literal scripture, and modernists, trying to reconcile faith and science. That debate raged through churches and universities.
Speaking of education, that was expanding too.
Massively. Compulsory grade school education spread. Public high schools became much more common. Normal schools, trained teachers, kindergartens appeared.
And Catholic schools
Grew rapidly to serve immigrant communities. Plus, adult education boomed. The Chautauqua movement was very popular. Illiteracy rates actually dropped significantly.
More opportunities in higher education too, for women.
Yes, more women were going to college. And the Morrill and Hatch Acts were crucial, setting up land-grant colleges, funding agricultural research. Philanthropy also played a big role, founding universities like Stanford and Chicago.
And major thinkers emerging.
William James stands out. His work in psychology, principles psychology, and philosophy, pragmatism, was foundational, really shaping American thought.
How did the press and literature reflect all these changes? Did newspapers change?
Dramatically. You got the rise of yellow journalism, sensationalism, scandals pioneered by Pulitzer and Hearst, competing fiercely for readers.
But there was pushback.
Syndicated news services provided more standardized reporting, acting as a bit of a check. And you had influential reform journals like The Nation, pushing for things like civil service reform.
And authors tackling the big issues.
Oh, absolutely. A whole wave of reformist writers. Henry George, Progress and Poverty, Single Tax Idea. Edward Bellamy, Looking Backward, Utopian Socialist Novel. Henry Damaris Lloyd, Blasting Big Business. Thorstein Veblen, Critiquing the Rich.
Rupert Rees.
Yes, his photos and writing and How the Other Half Lives were incredibly powerful, exposing slum conditions. Charlotte Perkins Gilman argued for women's economic freedom. Coin Harvey pushed for silver currency. Lots of voices tackling specific problems.
In fiction, did it move beyond those Horatio Alger rags to riches stories?
Definitely. While Alger was popular, the dominant trend became literary realism, trying to capture life as it actually was.
Whitman and Dickinson were still around.
Yes, continuing their unique work. But you also get Mark Twain, master of American dialect and frontier reality. Bret Hart writing about the gold rush, William Dean Howells focusing on ordinary people, social issues, Stephen Crane's Red Badge of Courage, Henry James exploring psychological depth.
And art reflected this too.
Yes, the realist school, Winslow Homer, Whistler, Eakins, depicted everyday life, leading into the early 20th century Ashkin School, which really focused on the grit and energy of the city.
So bringing this all together, it's hard to overstate the transformation between 1865 and 1900, just fundamental changes.
Absolutely. Explosive city growth, this incredible wave of diverse immigrants, widening class divides, all these reform movements bubbling up, huge shifts in thinking and culture. It really set the stage for the 20th century.
It really did. The impact was profound, lasting. You can see the roots of so much of modern America in this period.
It's true. The opportunities, the tensions, the debates, they shaped what came next in ways we still feel.
Which leaves you thinking, doesn't it? When you look at the speed of change back then, the challenges they faced, urbanization, immigration, inequality, technological shifts, what echoes do you see today?
That's a great question.
Yeah, what parallels or lessons might we draw for our own time of, pretty significant social and technological change? What parts of this history resonate most with the issues we grapple with now? Something to ponder.
Definitely something to think about.
Indeed. Well, that's all the time we have for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.